The theory of Kant's critique of judgment is generally regarded as a turning point in the history of aesthetics and the philosophy of art. It combines and reconstructs the results of the analyses of aesthetic predicates and the aesthetic attitude, which emerged in both Leibniz and Locke's schools, as they have been formulated by philosophers like Baumgarten and Sulzer on the one hand, and like Hume and Burke on the other. But it also elevated the aesthetic theory to a new level by integrating it into the framework of a new epistemology, which Kant had worked out in the Critique of Pure Reason, and which has been based on the view that what we call reason consists in a complex interaction of various epistemic operations. In order to understand what reason accomplishes, one has to look for operations from which such accomplishments arise. In addition, one has to look to the sources from which these operations originate and to the principles or rules that guide them. The critique of judgment discloses such a source for the appreciation of the beautiful and also the sublime. Thus, it proved to be able to separate aesthetic judgments from other types of judgments, while preserving their claim to originate in reason as such, and from activities which are interwoven with the activities all knowledge of our world depends on. These judgments, to be sure, don't express knowledge, but their claim is equally justified because it is founded upon the very same activities knowledge originates from, albeit in a distinctive interactive employment. By means of this view, Kant provided for the first time tools for establishing the aesthetic attitude as self-contained and autonomous, and thus as the foundation for a conception of art that envisages art as a primordial way of being related to and situated within our world, which can neither be replaced nor surpassed by other achievements of man's rational capacities. In this way, the critique of judgment has been perceived by the philosophers and theoreticians of art who succeeded Kant. And the result Kant arrived at became an almost unquestionable premise of the subsequent endeavors within aesthetics up to our time. This brief outline of Kant's accomplishment cannot be regarded as a correct description of Kant's own intention. He wrote the Critique of Judgment because he aimed at the completion of what he called his critical business, the investigation of all knowledge claims that include principles which cannot be justified by experience alone. Because of the failure of the metaphysics of the past, it had become indispensable to understand the origins of knowledge claims as the only means by virtue of which one could tell apart real knowledge from deeply rooted illusions. Because of the novelty and the difficulties of such an investigation, Kant believed that one could not rely on particular results before they could be confirmed and supported by results in other areas of knowledge where a priori principles apparently also come into play. And this methodologically holistic conviction implies that critical philosophy can establish itself decisively only as a system. In this way, we can explain why Kant felt that he had to write a critique of taste, that was the original title of the book as he envisaged it, to write a critique of taste when he arrived at the insight that the aesthetic judgment cannot be understood without including the claim that it is valid for every rational being of our kind, a claim which can neither be based upon experience nor upon rational proof. For this amounts to saying that a distinctive a priori principle must be involved. Consequently, given Kant's methodological conviction, a critical investigation became mandatory for the sake of the possible system. And this might sound as if Kant turned to the subject of aesthetics not for its own sake and almost involuntarily. In that case, one could easily suspect that he might have been ill-prepared for an analysis of the subtle and complex facts aesthetics has to come to terms with. One might even be tempted to admire Kant's genius because of his capability to compose such a rich and attractive work on aesthetic phenomena from a point of view and of interest which made him exclusively occupied with the task of completing the system of transcendental philosophy, and not with aesthetics. But this assessment of Kant's state of preparation for designing an aesthetics is grossly inadequate. For Kant had thought of its topics and problems for decades. Already in 1764, many decades before the publication of the Critique of Judgment, he had published an essay with, that's the title, Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime. And in the course of his lectures, he had to discuss frequently aesthetic problems. His government required that lecture courses had to use printed textbooks as guidelines. No lecture unless there is a textbook that can be submitted at the government. Kant, who held the share of logic and metaphysics, used in his annual major public courses textbooks of two leading aestheticians of his time, experts on aesthetics, Mayer's Logic and Baumgarten's Metaphysics. The logic Kant wanted to teach had a much broader scope than contemporary logic courses. Kant described it as an instruction of the ordinary intellect, as it borders on the one side upon ignorance and on the other side upon science and scholarship. Mayer's textbook appeared to suit this purpose comparatively well. But within its treatment of the various kinds of knowledge, it included such topics as the difference between a logical and an aesthetic perfection of knowledge, and between a logical, an aesthetic, and a practical truth. It is therefore little surprise that we find elaborate reports on Kant's views on aesthetics in transcripts of his logic courses. Kant gave his lecture course every summer. During the winters, he lectured metaphysics based on Baumgarten. The third of the four parts of this book contains, as an indispensable prerequisite for the doctrines of metaphysical or rational psychology, Baumgarten's Psychologia Empirica, the empirical psychology. Here we find definitions involve spirit of the powers and the activities of the mind. Kant must have known this text by heart, and we can assume that he presupposed it as a stock of general knowledge when he introduces his own conceptual apparatus in the key chapters of the Critique of Pure Reason. Yet Baumgarten's text also contains discussions of mental capacities and states that are of obvious importance within aesthetics. It also contains frequent references to the philosophical discipline Aesthetica, aesthetics, and to the very first book that carries this title, which had been published by Baumgarten himself. Within his metaphysics lecture courses, Kant spent only a minimum amount of time with Baumgarten's empirical psychology, but by no means because he assigned to it little importance. He rather had developed another, and this time private lecture course, where he received special payment, under the title Anthropology, which he gave also every winter. And these lectures were exclusively based on the Psychologia Empirica, the empirical psychology, of the very same textbook of Baumgarten's. Consequently, we can take it for granted that Kant had to discuss problems of aesthetics and to present his views on this subject twice every winter to different audiences. Therefore, it is no surprise that Kant was in the possession of his own aesthetics even before he came to terms with the problems he intended to solve in the Critique of Pure Reason. Although the numerous transcripts of his anthropology lectures still wait for publication, we can already design a sufficiently accurate picture of Kant's earlier aesthetics. For Kant's own notes to Baumgarten and Meyer, on which he based his lectures, have been preserved, and the transcripts of the logic and metaphysics lectures have been published as well. What is really surprising is the extent to which this aesthetics coincides in many regards with the theorems of the Critique of Judgment. Almost all of the notions of the third critique, the notions the third critique employs, have been used by Kant in approximately the same sense already 15 years earlier. Thus, to mention just a few, Kant explains the aesthetic attitude as resulting from a harmonious play of our mental faculties in general and of the active sources of our cognition, imagination and understanding in particular. These are theorems of the Critique of Judgment, but we find them 20 years earlier in the lecture transcripts already. He also remarks that it is judgment, the power of judgment, which is operative within this play and provides it with the true unity, whereby in turn the playful activity is strengthened. The play results in pleasure, and this pleasure of taste differs from the pleasures of the senses because it originates from an activity. It is disinterested because it has as its object only formal properties of what is given in intuition. Kant also distinguishes already quite clearly between the agreeable that pleases only particular subjects in changeable conditions, the beautiful that pleases everybody and universally, and the good that is approved on rational grounds and gives rise to pleasure only in various indirect ways. Yet Kant still persistently denied that the philosophical discipline of aesthetics can be founded upon a priori principles. One of the arguments by which he backs up this position is the lack of rules of taste. We could, to be sure, produce some such rules like order, proportion, symmetry, and harmony, but these rules are in turn founded upon our experience of what we take to be beautiful. They cannot be justified by reasoning alone. This argument, however, would be perfectly consistent with the position of the Critique of Judgment, which also excludes rules of taste for which one could pretend to provide a rational justification. Consequently, Kant's decisive argument must have been this: we cannot detect reasons why and in what circumstances the harmonious play of our cognitive faculties arises. It simply occurs. Therefore, the occurrence of the play can only be a fact within the natural constitution of human cognition. Its description has to be given within Psychologia Empirica, empirical psychology, in the strict sense, from which it follows that aesthetics has to be conceived of as an ultimately empirical discipline. Within this discipline, we can account for the special status of the aesthetic judgment, for the fact that it assumes the possibility of universal agreement, and thus for the further fact that we become engaged in disputes about the beautiful, whereas we refrain from such disputes in matters where the pleasure arises from sensation. It was precisely this argument that Kant abandoned when he conceived of the possibility of a critique of taste, which corresponds to what the preceding two critiques accomplished with regard to theoretical and practical reason. When he rethought his reasoning in the Epistemology of the Critique of Pure Reason, probably in the process of preparing the second edition. He rapidly arrived at the insight that his epistemological theorems about the relationship between imagination and understanding would provide him with means for an explanation of the aesthetic judgment, whose sources would not be empirical throughout, but rather derived from the explanation of the possibility of our knowledge of objects. Hence, the new explanation would have the structure of an a priori transcendental insight. We can now understand why Kant felt that he could carry out his plan once conceived with little trouble. Most of the content of his aesthetics had been available to him since long. Its views and its conceptual apparatus of the cognitive activities had only to be transferred to a new employment. Even the prior description of the distinctive features of the aesthetic judgment could be maintained. All along he had noticed that these judgments claim universal agreement and a validity that cannot be supported by decisive reasons. But now he found himself in the position to justify this claim and thus to deduce it. This doesn't amount to saying that Kant's earlier aesthetics remained entirely unchanged. Yet the change consisted less in additions to the theorems and innovations within the terminology, but rather in a greater precision in its employment. Previously, Kant's reference to a harmonious play of our cognitive faculties remained somewhat vague and flexible. The paradigmatic case for an object that occasions this heightened and harmonious activity had been for Kant the work of art, which indeed engages perception, imagination, judgment, and thoughtful reflection at the same time. In the new critique of taste, which soon became extended to the project of a critique of judgment, the notion of the play of the faculties received a more restricted and precise meaning. Engaged in the play were from now on only the very same activities of whom the Critique of Pure Reason had shown that they are operative within the process of the constitution of objects from given intuitions in space and time. Consequently, natural objects and products of the skilled crafts had to be moved into the position of paradigm cases of the beautiful, which was taken by the work of art previously. At the same time, and for the very same reason, the harmonious play became located closer to the perceptual process, and thus, as Kant expressed himself, deeper in the depths of the mind. A change one can hardly deplore, for an aesthetics that commences with a theory of art always proceeds on insecure and unexplored territory. If one would have to name a single component of the doctrines of the Critique of Pure Reason as the means by virtue of which Kant could accomplish the integration of his aesthetics into his epistemology, it could only be Kant's analysis of the various functions of imagination within cognition. In a note to the deduction chapter of the original edition of the first critique, Kant remarks proudly that no psychologist so far has conceived of the idea that imagination might be a necessary ingredient of perception itself. A perception is, according to Kant, a cognitive state in which a sensible manifold is present to us in a particular combination. And Kant believes himself in the possession of arguments to the effect that no combination can be given to us through the senses. It has to be established through a cognitive operation for which the potentials of our imagination are responsible. Because perception is the elementary conscious state in cognition, we are led to the conclusion that imagination is operative, at least in part, before consciousness can arise. Kant employs this theorem in many contexts, but primarily within his analysis of the way in which the notion of an object has to be understood, and of the way in which a world of objects is constituted for us through the activities of understanding. For the exertion of our imagination is not self-contained. Imagination is the source of all combinations within what is sensibly given to us, but one cannot combine, at least not combine a manifold into the structure of an object, unless unity principles can be presupposed which guide the combinatory activity and determine its objective. Hence, imagination in its most important cognitive usage depends upon pure concepts of an object that originate from our understanding as notions which are at the same time indispensable as the conditions for the possibility of the thought of ourselves, as a constant and unchangeable point of reference for all our thoughts and judgments. This is a brief summary of Kant's well-known tenets with regard to the relationship between imagination and understanding. And it provides us with means for elucidating the difficulties an interpretation of Kant's explanation of the aesthetic judgment has to face, because it reminds us of the basic design of the epistemology with reference to which Kant thought it possible and indeed necessary to move from an ultimately empirical aesthetics to an aesthetics founded upon transcendental principles. When Kant speaks within the critique of judgment of a harmonious play between imagination and understanding, he clearly appeals to his account of the two cognitive capacities as they had been analyzed within the critique of pure reason. In cognition and in the formation of knowledge, the two faculties necessarily cooperate, but certainly not in a harmonious play, which would require that the two players operate independently from one another. Imagination rather depends here thoroughly upon understanding and serves, so to speak, its purposes. Yet in the brief formative period of the critique of judgment, Kant convinced himself that there can be and indeed must be another way in which the operations of the two capacities are exerted in a coordinated way. Imagination can correspond spontaneously to a requirement established on the understanding's part, and this would in turn facilitate the understanding's business and thus strengthen and expand its own operations. Furthermore, the state within which this interaction would occur could not possibly be a case of an employment of a concept, for that would inevitably amount to still another case where the imagination could only serve rather than support freely the understanding's objective. Hence, one has to conceive of a cooperation between the faculty of combination, which is imagination, and the faculty of concepts, which is understanding, that takes prior to the employment of any particular concept. From this image of a distinctive way in which the most fundamental cognitive capacities cooperate, Kant's new theory of the aesthetic judgment could benefit in many ways. Aesthetic judgments are singular judgments. They are asserted while we are exposed to an individual object or scene, an object or a scene in a perceptual situation. And we can assert these judgments without having a description of the object at our disposal. We can find something beautiful without knowing anything about it. This is readily explained in terms of a cognitive process that takes place in close vicinity to the process of perceiving, and that precedes the process of concept formation in principle, although it is compatible with it. We can know something about the object we take to be beautiful. Furthermore, because the aesthetic judgment cannot be based on the usage of concepts, the reason for which it is asserted can only be the occurrence of a distinctive state of feeling with regard to the object or scene within a perceptual situation. And this feeling, in turn, can be explained as resulting from the animation and the quickening, as the English translation expresses Kant's theorem, the quickening of imagination and understanding within their harmonious play. In this way, Kant eventually was able to arrive at a stable relationship between well-defined concepts of imagination, understanding, play, and feeling, a stability that was lacking in his earlier aesthetics. That the play of the cognitive operations he envisaged had to be located so close to the perceptual process, such that the result of their coordinated play could be only revealed through a feeling, did not raise difficulties from Kant's point of view. His theory of perception requires anyway an employment of understanding that precedes judging and every conscious employment of concepts. Kant's model of the foundation of the aesthetic judgment includes, to be sure, a further component. The harmonious play is not only simply a fact that takes place in the depths of the mind, it depends intrinsically on the being noticed of the mutual accordance of the operations of imagination and understanding. Kant claims that it is the noticed accordance which results in a quickened activity. Thus, one might suspect that he has to take recourse to a cognitive accomplishment which cannot possibly proceed and result in nothing but a feeling. But this suspicion would be misguided, for Kant has at his disposition the notion of another mental activity which Wolff and his school had analyzed under the name of reflection. Reflection belongs, together with attention, to the most elementary employment of the intellect. It is a knowledge which always accompanies intrinsically the operations of the mind and helps to keep them within their distinctive boundaries. This results in the possibility of a comparison of the states and the accomplishments of operations which are connected to and entangled with one another. Reflection and comparison, such conceived, can take place and must take place in many cases independently from any explicit awareness. This notion of reflection has become totally alien to us, whereas Kant employs it in many variants and in a way which indicates that he assumes it's being familiar to everybody. To sum up, we can by now understand why Kant became convinced that his epistemology provides all the resources for an explanation of the aesthetic judgment, which would at the same time elucidate and justify its claim to universal agreement. The objective of a critique had been defined by Kant as the justification of such a claim by means of an elucidation of the conditions of its possibility. He found himself by now in the position to produce an account of these conditions. Consequently, he believed that the justification had been accomplished. And this explains that his reasoning within the critique of judgment frequently takes the form of a conclusion whose first premise is the fact that the claim of universal agreement is inevitably connected with the aesthetic judgment. And since the claim can only be explained by means of his account of the harmonious play, it must be this distinctive state of our cognitive faculties upon which the aesthetic judgment is founded. Just an inference. Such a stance, however, with regard to the fundamental problem of aesthetics can hardly satisfy as long as the principal tool of Kant's account remains insufficiently exposed and explained, the structure of the harmonious play itself. One could very well describe the fabrication of this tool in the critique of judgment as a combination of an old idea, the animation of the mind in a playful full activity, with the new theory of the synthetic activities of the mind, coming from the critique of pure reason, so recently developed. But viewed in this way, it makes mandatory efforts of ascertaining that the combination results in a structure that is free of tensions and at the same time a plausible image of the epistemic state, which is expressed through the aesthetic judgment. The text of the third critique accomplishes very little, indeed almost nothing in this regard. Kant uses repeatedly his phrase of the play between imagination and understanding. He also characterizes the states of the two operations which are engaged in the play in various ways. The most frequent and significant characterization describes the play of the imagination as free and contrasts it to the activity of the understanding in its lawfulness. But all this doesn't lead us very far and remains metaphorical to an unacceptable extent, as long as the phrase and its various extensions remain unsupplemented by further analyses and illustrations which clarify in precisely what way the cognitive operations take place and can take place in the way envisaged. Kant was not insensitive to the weaknesses of his expositions. In the preface, the latest part of the manuscript of the book, we can read a confession, which is certainly rare in Kant's work, and I quote, "Here, in the inquiry into our power of taste, given how difficult it is to solve a problem that nature has made so involved, I hope to be excused if my solution contains a certain amount of obscurity, an obscurity not altogether avoidable as long as I have established clearly enough that the principle has been stated correctly." Close quote. There's only one further place where Kant made a similar confession, this time concerning the first edition of the Transcendental Deduction. But in that case, he announced at the same time an improved version of his text and its argument, which he published soon afterwards. Whereas he never rewrote parts of the Critique of Judgment in subsequent editions. And my search for evidence of a continuous efforts on Kant's part in other writings and manuscripts remained rather unprofitable. It appears that Kant felt that he would not be able to proceed much further, and he imputed this to the matter of which he said that it is so involved. We have now arrived at the problem I want to solve in this lecture. Such a situation produces clearly a challenge to the interpreter to employ both exegetical and philosophical skills. He cannot hope to find passages in Kant by means of which he could decisively clarify the philosopher's thoughts and intentions. On the other hand, Kant by no means gives him permission just to repeat or vary his own phrases. An argumentative analysis is not only welcome, but definitely required. An analysis which explores the theoretical and argumentative potentials at Kant's dispositions. Only thus one can come up with a reading of the basic theorem in Kant's aesthetics, which is both Kantian in nature and an improvement compared to Kant's own expositions, which he himself admitted to be unsatisfactory. A survey of the secondary literature rapidly and disappointingly reveals that the challenge is only sometimes understood and nowhere met. Yet the task is difficult enough. It requires a mobilization of all the resources of Kant's epistemology. For although Kant did admit that his own inquiry into our power of taste remained obscure. He certainly believed that it fits perfectly into the complex doctrine of the interaction between imagination and understanding, which he had worked out in the epistemology of his critique of pure reason. In what follows, I shall present and put up for discussion a solution of the problem. When Kant admits that his inquiry remained obscure, he probably had two theorems in mind which jointly constitute the innovation of the third critique in comparison with his earlier aesthetics. Firstly, the theorem of the harmonious play of imagination and understanding, and secondly, the theorem about the way in which this harmonious state within cognition is revealed by a feeling. The second theorem raises the serious difficulties too, for the feeling has to be such that there can be no doubt that it is the aesthetic attitude which has been taking place. Otherwise, a distinctively aesthetic judgment could not be based upon it, let alone a judgment that claims universal agreement. But I shall disregard the latter problem, which can be solved without taking into consideration Kant's epistemology at large, and investigate exclusively the theorem of the harmonious play. The overall design of the critique of judgment is such that it can easily lead attempts to interpret Kant's theorem into impasses. Such an impasse can already result from the notion of the faculty of reflective judgment, which underlies the aesthetic as well as the teleological part of the third critique. Kant explains it by means of the acquisition over against the application of concepts or general terms. In one of its employments, the power of judgment applies general terms to particular cases. As such, it is determinative judgment. But we are frequently in situations that expose us to objects for which applicable general concepts are lacking. These situations call for the employment of reflective judgment, which searches for and develops the appropriate general concepts. Aesthetic judgments are based upon a usage of reflective judgment. That's the basic position Kant takes in the third critique. One has, however, to be cautious not to apply this model without further considerations. Its first intended application is the search for property classes objects in nature have in common, and thus the attempt to arrive at a classification of and a generalization over natural phenomena and the laws of nature. This concern is obviously quite remote from the situation within which aesthetic judgments are entertained and asserted. The classification of nature is a goal-directed, deliberate activity, whereas the aesthetic judgment can develop and be entertained spontaneously and independently of any deliberation and investigation. We would equally be led astray if we would modify the picture only by insisting that the search for concepts on the part of the power of reflective judgment in the aesthetic situation must be the search for ordinary general concepts of the first order. For this could easily commit us to the unwelcome conclusion that our reason for the usage of the predicate beautiful dissolves as soon as a general concept has been found that applies to the object in question. The aesthetic situation, however, must be understood in a way that does not collide with an indisputable fact. Aesthetic judgments are compatible with every conceivable way of classifying and theoretizing over a given object, provided that we are exposed to that object in a perceptual situation. The basic design of Kant's aesthetics encompasses still another trap one can easily walk into without the appropriate measures of caution. Kant substantiates the rightfulness of the claim to universal agreement on the part of the aesthetic judgment, also with the contention that the harmonious interaction between imagination and understanding is a necessary condition of the possibility of empirical knowledge. Well-known assertion on his part. If condition would have to be read here in a strong sense, and thus as prerequisite, it would either follow that every object with respect to which we can possibly have knowledge has to be beautiful in the first place, or it would follow that we cannot arrive at any knowledge about objects unless we experience the beauty of some object at the same time. The second absurdity is only of a slightly lesser magnitude than the first one. Consequently, both conclusions have to be avoided by all means. Yet to see this and to discern a viable escape from the impasse are obviously two quite different things. So far, the results we have arrived at remain negative. But they suggest that we cannot expect an easy solution of our problem. The power of judgment functions prominently in the critique of pure reason, specifically in the chapter that precedes the discussion of the principles of pure understanding, the chapter which exposes Kant's doctrine of the schematism. Since it also deals with the relationship between understanding and imagination, it is likely from the outset that Kant, at least in part, alludes to this doctrine when he connects his aesthetics with the foundations of his epistemology. But once again, caution is in order, for two reasons. First, whatever the doctrine of the schematism amounts to, in particular, it certainly employs the notion of the power of judgment in its determinative sense. Concept, that is to say in this case, the categories are at our disposal. The way in which they can be applied to particular instances of what is given in intuition is the question up for discussion. Yet reflective judgment operates in the reverse direction, and the usage of the power of judgment that moves from the intuitions toward the categories cannot even be conceived of, precisely because the categories originate prior to and independently from all intuitions. And second, imagination is responsible for the formation of perceptions. And since the origination of the aesthetic attitude is located by Kant in close vicinity to the perceptual process, one has reasons to suspect that it is somehow entangled with the process through which we originally become aware of objects in general. And there is some truth in this. But again, any attempt to approximate the two processes without emphasizing their difference would lead to unacceptable results. For the aesthetic judgment always presupposes that an object is already given to us, of which we then judge that it is beautiful. This judgment, to be sure, is based upon the perception of the object, and this feature of it has to be accounted for. But the operation or set of operations through which a world of given objects is disclosed to us, and which gives all perceptions of objects within this world their distinctive formal constitution, cannot be the very same process on which, in whatever way, the aesthetic judgment is based. For aesthetic judgments are individual judgments on particular objects within particular perceptual situations. We have arrived at still another negative result. I think it's the sixth already. This, in a way, also summarizes what you find in the literature. It leads us, however, to a conclusion which reduces the range of possible solutions of our problem, and thus to a first result which we shall be able to maintain. We cannot hope to render intelligible Kant's talk of the play between imagination and understanding as long as we interpret understanding as the power that employs the categories as unity principles of the synthetic activity of imagination. Consequently, the function of judgment which is reflective and thus in search of concepts, has to be understood, at least first of all, as being in search of empirical concepts. But then we have to be afraid of being pushed back again into one of the impasses already discussed. In his lectures on logic, Kant always expounded the analysis Wolff had given of the formation of empirical concepts as his own. And this is as follows: we compare given objects, reflect upon what they have in common, and abstract from the rest, whereby what they have in common becomes the content of a concept that applies to the objects in question as well as to other objects. This is a traditional theory of concept formation. Here we encounter again the notion of reflection in one of his many usages. But we have already shown why the aesthetic judgment cannot be understood as a preliminary stage on the way towards the actual acquisition of empirical concepts. For two reasons: aesthetic judgments are and remain distinctive singular judgments. They can never be replaced by the application of descriptive contents. Furthermore, and even more importantly, the situation within which they make sense doesn't include any comparison with other objects. But to compare is the first among the activities which are required for the formation of empirical concepts, according to Kant's explicit teaching. I arrive at still more negative results until I reach a point where the solution becomes obvious. And it also becomes obvious that we can only take this course, and all the other possibilities have been excluded. Now the situation begins to look very much like a dilemma. One of its horns prevents us from having recourse to the relationship between imagination and concepts a priori, the categories. Not viable at all. The other horn exposes us to the threat that any recourse to the only alternative, the formation of empirical concepts, is condemned to failure too. Yet whereas a model that projects the play of the powers upon the employment of the categories has been definitely excluded, we might still be able to arrive at a solution by means of a more sophisticated utilization of Kant's view with regard to the formation of empirical concepts. Consequently, we have to turn to such an attempt. Kant wrote two versions of the introduction to the Critique of Judgment. He discarded the first because of its length and rewrote the entire text shortly before the printing of the book. But the first introduction had been written half a year earlier, while the problems of aesthetics, which are discussed in the oldest portion of the work, were still much more vividly on Kant's mind. Thus, it is no surprise that the first introduction contains some clues to an adequate reconstruction of Kant's line of reasoning. Kant substantiates here his contention that the play of the faculties takes place at the very beginning of the process of conceptualization, by remarking that the aesthetic attitude arises, quote, before we attend to a comparison of an object with another, close quote. But comparison is the first activity which leads to the formation of empirical concepts. And this amounts to saying that a process of reflection commences with regard to the possible formation of concepts before any attempt to discover what objects share has been made. One can, of course, not avoid wondering in what way the faculty of understanding can become involved and then operative in a sufficiently elementary manner within a situation such conceived. To repeat, Kant describes the situation within which the harmonious play takes place with reference to imagination, of whom he says that its operation is free, as well as with reference to understanding, of whom he says that it is involved in its lawfulness. Once again, we must wonder in which way understanding in its lawfulness can enter a situation which cannot be elucidated with reference to the constitutive usage of the categories, and which precludes equally the availability of general empirical concepts. And now we have arrived at a decisive turning point. Once one has realized that it is precisely this question that has to be answered, a solution of our problem can begin to emerge. That Kant himself must have envisaged it can again be shown by means of passages from the first introduction. The key term for it, which Kant employs only here in a prominent way within the context of aesthetics, is the term exhibition. Darstellung in German, and in older translation the term is translated as presentation. Exhibition. The introduction of the term into the language of philosophy is one of the many accomplishments of Kant. He employs it within his theory of the usage of concepts. While Kant's theory of the acquisition of concepts remained the traditional one, he has designed a rather advanced view with regard to the possession and the usage of concepts. And I believe that in the light of this advanced theory, he should have revised his theory of concept acquisition, what he never did. This rather advanced view is developed from his central doctrine about the fundamental difference between intuition and concept and their mutual dependence upon one another within knowledge. Concepts without intuitions are not only empty in the well-known general sense of Kant's famous sentence, they are also empty, or rather not really in our possession, if we don't know how to apply them. But applying them means to be capable of producing instances of them in intuition. Instances can, to be sure, be produced in many ways, and the more abstract the concepts are, the more difficult this will be. But Kant holds that ordinary and ultimately instances have to be produced in intuition, whose unitary form is temporal and spatial. It is this context within which the term exhibition acquires its philosophical meaning. To exhibit a concept means to associate with it in intuition a manifold of a distinctive, unitary, temporal and/or spatial shape. The only explicit exposition of the theorem will again be found in the chapter on the schematism. Its objective is the exhibition of the categories, thus of concepts a priori. But Kant states clearly that the possession of empirical concepts includes the capability to exhibit them as well. And in retrospect to the analyses of taste, the first introduction points out with equal clarity the power of judgment holds up the imagination, as it merely apprehends the objects, to the understanding as it exhibits a concept in general. We are now in the position to illustrate Kant's metaphorical talk of the harmonious play in a way that is suitable for enlightening the aesthetic experience to a considerable extent. But in advance, a possible objection and a difficulty which might have prevented the interpreters from arriving at an adequate reading of Kant's critique of taste should be briefly discussed. One could object that the exhibition of a quality, like red, can consist in the production of some red object, while Kant insists that within the aesthetic situation only formal, namely spatial and temporal features count. But then we have to remind ourselves that within the aesthetic situation no particular concept can be exhibited, for the absence of appropriate concepts is essential to it. If the understanding is operative within the aesthetic situation as the power of exhibiting concepts, it must be by virtue of a feature which is distinctive for the performance of an exhibition of concepts which are derived from perceptions in a general and formal way. And this can be only the unity and the precision of an arrangement of a perceived manifold in space and time. A further difficulty with the Kantian theory of the foundation of the aesthetic judgment we are about to design seems to be this. The direction within which reflective judgment operates is from perceptions and imagination towards understanding and its concepts. But exhibition is, in contrast, a notion which has its place within the theory of the usage and the application of concepts. Thus, it appears to be confined to the scope of the activity of determinative judgment, the opposite of reflective judgment. And that disqualifies it from any usage within a Kantian aesthetics. This difficulty can strike one as very serious. It might even explain in part Kant's failure to present his view all along with reference to exhibition as the contribution of understanding to the aesthetic situation. Nevertheless, the difficulty dissolves rapidly on this stage of our investigation, namely in the following way. It is reflective judgment that holds up the power of imagination as it perceives and thus synthesizes a manifold to the understanding. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is engaged in a search for concepts that would actually apply to the perception in question. It rather compares the state of imagination with the conditions of a possible conceptualization in general. Yet a symptom of the possession of a concept is always the possibility of its being exhibited in intuition. One cannot even look and search for concepts unless one conceives them already in the light of the way in which they can be exhibited. But that amounts to saying that the ascent of reflective judgment from imagination toward understanding necessarily always already takes into account the way in which concepts are generally applied and thus exhibited. And this is precisely the way in which understanding as such enters the play prior to the acquisition of any particular concept. The picture of a harmonious play that begins to emerge has many attractive aspects from the point of view of aesthetics. Kant links the aesthetic experience closely to the cognitive process, but he can still avoid its intellectualization. He is also capable of accounting for both the complexity and the internal unity objects we describe as beautiful exhibit. It is imagination which provides the complexity, and it is the accordance with the general structure of exhibition which provides the concise unity of the form. Both features can be encountered in perception as such, but their harmony is revealed only through the intellectual operation of reflection, which in turn makes continuously reference to what only the understanding can accomplish. It will be hard to find other aesthetic theories that could claim similar achievements. But our account of the harmonious play remains still incomplete, for we have not yet discussed in which way the freedom of imagination enters the picture. Kant describes, as one will remember, the harmonious play as taking place between imagination in its freedom and understanding in its lawfulness. In its ordinary operations, imagination is by no means free. It rather serves other cognitive powers in various ways. It synthesizes what is given in intuition according to the rules of understanding, the categories. It apprehends particular manifolds while respecting the way in which the manifolds are given. And it provides instances of empirical concepts by designing appropriate images for them, by means of which the concepts are exhibited. Three services on the part of the imagination. What then does it mean that it operates freely? In order to respond to the question, one can reason in the following way. A power that is suitable for so many services hardly depends thoroughly upon one of the masters it serves or upon all of them jointly. It must have the potential to operate in a way that is both natural to itself and the source of its flexibility within so many different functions. All the bound functions of imagination amount to the constitution of particular forms and shapes. Thus, if the activity of imagination develops freely, it will pass through manifolds in various ways and produce traces of forms without aiming at particular forms and without stopping when they have been attained. The fantasia in music is thus not by accident named after an employment of imagination, which, following Kant, has a cognitive analog or foundation. Kant followed Hobbes in analyzing pleasure as the heightened state, the quickening of an activity. Thus, the free activity of imagination must be pleasing in itself. It is, however, not yet equivalent to the harmonious play of the cognitive powers. This play does not take place before the free employment of imagination results by itself in the creation of forms that correspond to the general feature of an exhibition of an empirical concept. In these cases, the lawfulness of understanding is fulfilled without coercion, and this in turn at least appears to facilitate the understanding's activity, and it strengthens the understanding's readiness to form concepts and to apply them, which means to exhibit them. Imagination profits from this accordance too, for the power of understanding refrains from further interfering within such a situation. It rather accepts and approves the continuation of the free activity of its counterpart. Moreover, one has to bear in mind that all this has to take place within a perceptual situation. Exhibition requires that the precise form of an empirical object will be produced. It could appear as if this would be incompatible with the freedom of imagination. But Kant claims correctly that it is quite conceivable that an object presents in perception precisely that form imagination would create while being engaged in its free activity. In addition, the very same form can be such that it suits the general feature of exhibition. Whenever all these three conditions are fulfilled at the same time, the harmonious play originates. It results in the readiness of the mind to contemplate the object in question continuously until the needs of the daily life or the tiring of the attention brings it to an end. We describe such an object as beautiful. The aesthetic state of the harmonious play is embedded in many other cognitive operations. It is preceded by the constitution of a world of objects. The free performance of imagination is in accordance with the perception of a particular empirical object, and the understanding can entertain any knowledge with regard to the object it might possess. This knowledge would not disturb the aesthetic situation, nor contribute to it in any way. But the power of reflective judgment is constitutive for the situation. For by virtue of reflection alone, the accordance of the accomplishments of the two powers can be noticed. The power of imagination, to be sure, can refrain free within its perceiving without any reference to understanding as such. But the heightened activity of understanding depends upon the noticing of the accordance of its own activity with the freedom of imagination. The harmonious agreement of the cognitive powers, thus conceived, is playful in a particular sense. The mutual agreement comes about without coercion, and the two activities concur automatically. The play can thus be compared to a dance of two partners who harmonize in their movements without influencing one another and who enjoy their performance. We have, however, to admit that at the very few places where Kant doesn't speak only in abstraction about the play, he conceives it more frequently as an interaction. In that case, a ball game, to be sure without competition, would be a more appropriate example. In the lecture transcript from the winter 1794-5, one finds a fairly detailed description. Kant attributes here to the power of understanding the function of curbing the imagination in certain senses. Within its free play, imagination tends to become extravagant. If that happens, understanding recalls it to order, and only thus the harmonious play is secured. I suggest that we take this as a somewhat misguided description of the play itself. Maybe the student didn't get Kant's view correctly. The description confuses a quite imaginable secondary component of the play with its primary overall constitution. But the lecture transcripts provide us with another, this time very interesting observation with regard to the play. It explains, among other things, why Kant is inclined to call also the play itself free, and why he could very well describe the entire state of the mind within the play as a state of freedom. This is the way in which he describes the situation. Our knowledge depends upon the operations of powers that are very different in nature and origin. Hence, the acquisition of knowledge inescapably depends upon mutual coercion. Our understanding is restricted in its usage to what is given in intuition. And our imagination has to serve under the unity principles of understanding. And now I quote, "They are like two friends who dislike but can't relinquish one another. For they live in a continuous fight and yet can't miss one another." Close quote. By taking up, that's the situation within which knowledge originates. It's hard and difficult to arrive at it. By taking up Kant's illustration, we can say that only in the aesthetic situation the fight comes to an end, the coercion ceases, and an unconstrained accordance takes place. It is no surprise that such a state will be experienced with pleasure. This way of accounting for the play is directly derived from what is distinctive in the foundation of Kant's epistemology, the fundamental difference of the two sources, intuition and understanding and concept. Although it is only an illustration, we are permitted to take it seriously. But then it becomes indispensable to qualify another assertion on Kant's part, which is to the effect that the harmonious play is a prerequisite for the possibility of knowledge. It has become totally impossible to read this such that it amounts to claiming that only through an aesthetic situation we are capable of arriving at empirical knowledge. But another reading suggests itself immediately. The harmonious agreement of the cognitive powers arises, albeit only in very rare perceptual situations, from nothing but the fundamental constitution of the powers in question. Consequently, we have the right to assume that it is a possible state of every mind whose knowledge is of the same kind as ours. But then we have also the right to expect that all human beings will eventually agree with our own well-considered aesthetical judgments. And this suffices for justifying the claim of a distinctive a priori validity, which is inseparable from the aesthetic judgment. We don't need the claim that the aesthetic situation is a prerequisite for the possibility of knowledge in the other strong sense. It is the theory of the harmonious play of imagination and understanding that provides Kant with the most important resources of his critique of taste, and thus of the most innovative part of the critique of judgment. His language of faculties and powers of the mind can easily strike the reader as archaic, but we have seen that it can be translated with ease into a language of cognitive operations, and that, within the present philosophical climate, sounds less obsolete than it did 2 decades ago. Besides, one should always assess the merit of a theory with respect to the degree in which it illuminates the facts of its intended application. We already began to realize that Kant's accomplishments in this regard are rather impressive. He refrained, to be sure, almost altogether from pointing out in detail how his theory can be put to work within an analysis of the aesthetic experience. That he himself felt that he had lacked clarity about some features of the design of the theory is in part responsible for this failure. I have tried to clarify and to substantiate Kant's fundamental theorem and to produce an improved version of it, but exclusively with means Kant himself provides and also alludes to, and thus it's still an interpretation. In conclusion, I like to indicate a merit of Kant's aesthetics that should still grant it a place within the spectrum of contemporary aesthetic theories. Kant is certainly a formalist. He is committed to the view that beauty and every other elementary and purely aesthetic quality depend exclusively on the formal arrangement of a perceived manifold. He aligns himself with a tradition which conceived of aesthetic phenomena in the light of the formula of the unity in the manifold. Goes back to Plato. It is, however, well known that the formula remains vague and that it is difficult to assign to it a precise meaning, which does not render the aesthetic analysis either counterintuitive or circular. This has frequently led to the charge that formalism in aesthetics is unpromising or outright inadequate. On the other hand, formal analyses are certainly indispensable means for evaluating aesthetic qualities and artistic achievements. The well-known formalist theories of this century are really lacking a serviceable notion of form. Such a notion would have to distinguish effectively mathematical and ontological form from the aesthetic form. It would also have to avoid taking recourse to the theory of gestalt formation, which is too weak for explaining what is distinctively aesthetic. Besides, the form of aesthetic objects exhibit tensions and contrasts that are encompassed and dissolved by a dynamics which is an essential aspect of the aesthetic form as such. This observation, this correct observation, gave rise to the theories which interpret form as an expression or a projection of bodily tensions and movements, as Susan Langer did. But this leads, unfortunately, to the removal of the aesthetic experience from the processes of cognition. One would have hoped that the most prominent contemporary theory, that of Nelson Goodman, would improve the situation. But to the extent to which he tries to account for aesthetic form, Goodman's theory is caught in a circle, I claim. A theory of the aesthetics, a theory of the Kantian style must become attractive within such an environment. It preserves the close connection between the aesthetic experience and the fundamental structures of cognition. It also accounts for cognition in terms of mental activities. Thus, it might be in a better position to come up with an analysis of the dynamics within aesthetic form. And while being a formalist theory, it distinguishes clearly between ontological and mathematical form on the one hand and aesthetic form on the other hand. Even after 200 years, it remains promising to pursue such a program. Kant himself encourages us to do so and not to confine ourselves to the words of the Critique of Judgment, which, I quote again, did only state the principle clearly enough. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Will you? Thank you.
Go ahead.
I have a question about the power of reflective judgment in your explanation or your theory about the harmonious interplay of imagination and understanding. What exactly is, it seems to me that reflective judgment in this way, as you say, heightens the understanding, awareness, or the awaiting of intuition. Excuse me, I'm getting confused. I'll start again. What I'm interested in is clarification about reflective judgment and its role in the explanation of the harmonious interplay between imagination and understanding. And I'm wondering if, in the explanation of reflection, whether you would find it faulty in a way that you cited in Fichter's original insight, that there is something which Kant cannot explain, does not use, because his theory itself about the nature of reflection is faulty.
It's fault.
Faulty.
That is an interesting point, but would require a longer discussion, I believe. We have to distinguish between reflection and reflective judgment. And of course, this already poses a new problem. One has to relate reflection to reflective judgment in some way. Reflection is the general process of focusing on particular states of the mind such that they can be told apart from other states. One notices what is distinctive to a particular state of the mind. That is the accomplishment on reflection's part. In general, reflective judgment is more restricted. It also performs this activity of noticing what is distinctive to A and B, and here to intuition, to imagination, and to understanding. But its distinctive accomplishment, reflective judgment, is to hold up, as Kant himself says, the state of imagination to the state of understanding. So we notice what the state of imagination is, and we notice what the state of understanding is. And the objective of reflective judgment is to see in what way it starts off from imagination. The state of imagination corresponds to the state of understanding. And the noticing on the part of reflective judgment that the state of imagination corresponds to the objective of understanding, which is in need of exhibition, is indeed the prerequisite, according to my reconstruction of Kant's argument, for a heightened, a quickened activity of understanding. Understanding arrives, this is of course a metaphorical expression of the situation, so to speak, to the insight that imagination cooperates spontaneously, freely with it. And that means, again, metaphorically speaking, that understanding needs less force in order to control imagination, and which in turn makes the activity of understanding, which is in this case the employment and the application of concepts, easier, which leads to the heightened activity. So it is really understanding whose play in the whose part in the play depends thoroughly on reflective judgment. Now, what I haven't done, and what's nowhere done in literature, is interpreting the various employments of the notion of reflection. 3 years ago, I presented reflection in another usage as the means for a design of a methodology of the critique of pure reason. So we have a very general usage of reflection and a very particular one, which is part of the definition of reflective judgment.
And I guess what I found so exciting in your essay on Fichte, Geschwindigkeit und Einsicht was your suggestion that in not recognizing Fichte's discovery of the flaw in Kant's theory, that we have failed to follow through on the nature of self-consciousness.
Right, yeah. That is a big issue. That's a big issue. When I wrote this Fichte thing, I'm of course pleased that you know it. I didn't know anything about the meaning of the term reflection in Kant. These are totally different, and I would very much like seeing a dissertation on the shifts of meaning of the term reflection, which took place around 1790. Kant employs the notion of reflection in various ways, which has a totally different meaning from reflection in the subsequent philosophy, and also reflection in our ordinary usage of the term. So I don't know whether it was a shift in ordinary usage, which I doubt very much, or rather a change in the philosophical, in the design of the philosophical theory that led to a shift in meaning of this term. That's interesting. You know, we have many terms in our ordinary language whose meaning depends on philosophical insights, and maybe sometimes misguided insights. You know. And reflection seems to be one of them. And no wonder that, no surprise that we, as soon as that term, you know, has its experience in philosophy, we are entangled in difficulties which are such that we don't know what they consist in. And it would be very much needed study on the development of a key concept in philosophy. Frequently key concepts are taken for granted and nowhere defined. You find reflection defined in Christian Wolff, but nowhere in Kant, except in lecture transcripts. Yeah. And then the meaning shifts, and again it's taken for granted what it means, and the confusion becomes unavoidable. So,
it seems to me there is a possible a priori thesis about Kant that is not realized, and I wanted to ask you a question about it. In the case of the critique of pure reason, Kant works out much more of the particular metaphysical details and apply the nature of the metaphysical foundation of natural science. And it's correspondingly in the case of the critique of actual reason, he has metaphysics of moral, and has a lot of details of a rather concrete kind. Now, it seems to me, thinking about the history of the subject of aesthetics and taking your remarks about formalism, one would have thought that Kant would have followed the Critique of Judgment with a metaphysic of aesthetic in which he would have used this large amount of historical material on symmetry and proportion, that it had such a large role all the way through Plato. And it would have appealed to him enormously in terms of its formality, its systematic character. And yet he doesn't seem to have done that. My question is, in his lectures, for example, did he make use of that systematic material that has played such a role earlier historically in aesthetic ideas? Because it would seem so completely part and parcel of Kant's way of thinking to have done that.
He couldn't possibly apply his aesthetics within the metaphysics of the beautiful in the same manner in which he could apply his critique of knowledge in metaphysical Anfangsprinciple, is it?
Yeah, but metaphysics of
Principle.
But
And
let's
the
take
same-
metaphysics of morals. I mean, the metaphysics of morals, though, faces the same problem. All the discussion of moral philosophy has precisely the problem of the critique of judgment. I mean, it cannot be done within systematic knowledge. So that objection doesn't really hold. I agree with you, there's a distinction in relation to the metaphysical foundation of natural science, but not in relation to the metaphysics of morality.
No, I think that the metaphysics of moral and the metaphysical science fall into one compartment, and the aesthetics would fall into another one, precisely because there are no a priori principles which are in need of application. So the situation is different, but this is a subtlety which I shouldn't make too much out of in order to respond to your question. I think that Kant could have written not a metaphysics of the beautiful, but an applied aesthetic, which he didn't do and never intended to do, and as far as we can infer from the transcripts of the lectures, they are not as rich in detailed aesthetic analyses after the publication of the Critique of Judgment as they were prior to it. So it is. I think it is quite obvious that Kant had an uncomfortable feeling with what he could accomplish in the Critique of Judgment, and as I showed by producing the quotation, he didn't hide it. He admitted it. Nobody, as far as I know, has so far made something out of this confession, which is rather remarkable. So you need, in order to apply the doctrine, more clarity about it. So I'll suggest another dissertation. There is an object. It doesn't matter whether I know anything about it or not. I can know everything about it. That wouldn't help me to tell whether it's beautiful or not. I have to perceive it in order to be able to say that. But what does it then mean that I say it's beautiful? I think Kant is very plausible in taking the approach that this has to do something with our cognitive approach to things. But it can't consist in a cognition. So it must be the same resources that are operative in our aesthetic attitude, which are also constitutive for knowledge as other sources of knowledge, but not used in such a way that knowledge arises or matters. And this already narrows down considerably the space within which you can try to envisage a theory. So, I think that it didn't show this. One can't even deduce from Kant that one has to expect that most objects in the world are not beautiful. Because the ordinary situation of cognition is this mutual coercion. whereas the free play is unusual, and it depends on the coincidence of a cooperation of so many factors that one can't expect that it occurs very frequently. But this is another facet of the elaboration of the theory, which Kant unfortunately didn't even begin with.
I had a question about your remark that Kant had a new theory of the use of concepts, and you said it involves an exhibition of the concept. And I'm sure I didn't get the details of what you were saying, but I wonder whether you could say something about how it compares to Aquinas' theory of concept usage, in which when you use a concept, you have to also, you might say, exhibit the concept by forming an image of something that falls under the concept.
I remember Geach's assessment of Aquinas' achievement in this regard. I'm not an Aquinas expert, so I really should refrain from comparing Kant to Aquinas, but I could say something on general views with regard to concept formation in our time. Of course, there is some similarity with Wittgenstein's views, but it's very limited. The similarity consists just in the shared claim that you haven't a concept if you can't do something with it. And Kant, by the way, is the first who, as far as I know, maybe Aquinas, if Geach is correct, it has been the first who states that explicitly. And well, one of the deans of the theory of concept application has been Price, the British philosopher Price. In, I think, Thinking and Experience, there is a long chapter on the application of concepts, where the production of images is one of the symptoms of the possession of a concept, and this is regarded generally as a dispositional account of what a concept consists in. And there has been a long debate on this. Afterwards, I don't know where we arrived at within this debate. At this time, it somehow appears to have vanished from the set of problems that are of central interest to philosophers. Peter Heath, in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a wonderful work, gives you an account of the state of the debate at the time of the publishing of the encyclopedia. It means in the 60s. I did some bibliographical searching on illuminating more recent views and couldn't find any. But this is something I would like to learn from you about. So look, Kant has this, and he really discovered this, and he had to arrive at this insight, because he always was committed to the view that concepts for themselves are almost nothing. You can't accomplish anything, you have only a concept. That is an implication of the basic arrangement of the first critique, which hasn't been noticed adequately. But it follows immediately from this elementary approach of Kant. So he was easily led to the insight that thinking of concepts necessarily has to imply thinking about the way in which they are applied. And we can't even conceive of concepts without conceiving of their being applied in the first place. And that was, by the way, my most powerful tool in the interpretation I was producing. I did produce. So Kant somehow couldn't avoid arriving at this view, and he uses it in his aesthetics, but he maintained his ancient view on concept formation. and this is the third dissertation I suggest, what would a Kantian theory of concept formation be like, which would be freed from these remnants of the Wolffian school within the corpus of the critique? I think there is more than a tension, there is even a contradiction between Kant's notion of concept formation and Kant's notion of concept possession and application. Fortunately, it doesn't affect the concept of the reflective judgment, because the reflective judgment in its aesthetic employment operates prior to concept formation. It is only in need of a view of what a concept consists in, and that in turn implies the application of the concept. So we are in a fortunate situation within aesthetics. We don't suffer from the Wolffian remnants in Kant's theory of concept acquisition, but it isn't easy to come up with an account of what concept formation might be. In a Kantian theory, which could match the contemporary state of debate. We have in the cognitive sciences and in psychology lots of attempts to understanding concept acquisition. Piaget is one of the founder figures for that. And in psychological literature, one can find Piaget is a Kantian in a way. So there is really something interesting to be done.
I think we have time for one more question, and I'll give that honor to Professor first.
That's a pity, I have to say, because now I can learn something.
I have a question about the conclusion you arrive at when you say that since we all share or have in common the same cognitive faculties, we have a right to expect that all human beings will eventually agree with our own well-considered aesthetical judgment. And my question, put very simply, is, isn't this conflating the quaestio quid facti with the quaestio quid juris? I mean, Kant says in section 40 that only if the universal communicability carried with it an interest for us, could we then explain how we can demand universal agreement? And he says clearly that we cannot do that. And that's why the dialectic is needed, and only when we come to section 59 and he shows that morality, that beauty is a symbol of the morally good, is the quaestio quid juris answer. And it seems to me that you not only leave this out, but you seem to suggest that there is no quaestio left over here to be answered. The very fact that we all have these cognitive faculties in common entitles us to expect agreement in our judgment. And isn't this a conflation?
I mean, that is what I think. I think that what follows is very interesting and important supplementation, but not fundamental. The earlier aesthetic theory, which already has the notion of the interplay of the faculties and already distinguishes the aesthetic judgment from other types of judgments with reference to its claim to universal validity, has no means for accounting for the precise way in which these powers or faculties operate. Whereas the critique of judgment, by employing the apparatus of the critique of pure reason, can do that. And I think that suffices for justifying the claim. The dialectics has to do with, I think, another problem.
But then the original analysis of the judgment of case must be mistaken.
Why?
I mean, it cannot be a component then that we demand as a duty that others agree with us in our judgment of case.
Well, that, of course, we can't. And this poses the problem of the dialectics. We make a claim, but on the other hand, we know that we can't really fight it out and bring the disagreement that might originate to a conclusion. The claim is a specific one. And it has to be understood in its specificity in order to elucidate fully the aesthetic situation as it differs from cognition and the moral point of view. But what, I mean, I could give you the question back, what could possibly accomplish with what comes afterwards within the critique of judgment? The symbol of, I mean, the doctrine of the beauty as a symbol of the good can never account for the claim to universal validity, or the claim of universal validity on the part of the aesthetic judgment, because it already presupposes it. The beautiful can be a symbol of the good only because it already comes with such a claim.
You want to reply, or should we retire upstairs?
This is a professional debate. I learned that a course on the critique of judgment taught by Professor anyway be given this semester, so I assume that many of the students are in here. I really regret that we obviously can't pursue the discussion, because normally only after a number of questions one arrives at the questions one really wants to stick with.
Let me remind you that on Tuesday, 4:15, same room, the moral image of the world, the second of the lectures, refreshment upstairs. Thank you very much.